Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the November 16th, 2022 meeting of the Auburn School Committee. Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, let's start with introductions down here to my right, please.
Dan Poisson, Ward 5.
Ryan Belknap, Ward 4.
Clarissa Perez Armendariz, Ward 1.
Karen Matthew, Ward 3.
Abigail Fauché, Student Representative.
Jillian Dumais, Student Representative.
Sue Doris, Assistant Superintendent.
Connie Brown, Superintendent of Schools.
Mark Conrad, Business Manager.
Thank you all, and Pam Albert has an excused absence this evening, as does Mayor Jason Levesque, although he may be able to join shortly. All right, I'll open up to public participation at this time. Do we have anyone from the public who would like to come address the school committee? Seeing none, I'll close public participation, and let's move on with tonight's pretty much one and only item on the agenda, which is the budget discussion for the 23-24 school year. And with that, Dr. Brown and Mr. Conrad, I'll let you take it away.
I'm going to have to push this with one hand and talk with the other. So welcome to the first presentation of the 23-24 school year budget. Seems hard to believe that we've started to think about that, but it's actually the first formal step that we take to get you thinking about what parameters you'll set for the budget for us, and it's our opportunity to share with you some of the fixed costs that we see on the horizon that we want to make sure you have on your radar. So as I've shared with you before, the budget is really a year-round process, and at any point we have three budgets open. We have the one that we are looking to, which would be 23-24. We have the one that we are in, which is 22-23, and the one that we've just finished, which is 21-22. So we are referencing all three of those at any given point in time. So we're going to talk a little bit this evening about the budget development process. We're going to share with you personnel cost increases for 23-24. I'd like to use this opportunity to remind you that we are a people business, and therefore 80% of our costs are related to people. Salaries, benefits, fixed costs, and so on are included in that 80%. We would like to share with you projections for the debt service and some other considerations for the new Edward Little High School. And then we'd like you to have some discussion with us around guidance for the 23-24 school year. So Mr. Conrad, if you would begin. So this is the first evening we start this discussion. We started using this process about 3 years ago, and it's worked really well. There are some things that we've built in, and the second item is the City Council meeting. We will meet with them on December 19th. That's a Monday, 5:30 in workshop format. I will provide talking points to you before that meeting, as I have in the past. The council is always interested in how the schools are doing and what gains we've made, and there are certainly things to celebrate this year. We are deserving of a lot of accolades. So the next item is the month of March, and pretty much every Wednesday, so book it now, will be devoted to budget development. The first presentation will be March 1st. That's the night you get your budget books. We are still old school. We use the 3 to 5 inch binders, and we'll give you a copy of all of the information that we have from schools and revenue and all the other things that go into the budget. We will go through all the cost centers through the 1st through the 22nd. Some take a little longer than others, just as a reminder that the cost center 1, sometimes called Article 1, is all of regular education. Cost center 2 is special education. Cost centers 4 is athletics, instruction, and 5, student staff support and curriculum and instruction, Dr. Doris's world. The next week we get into cost center 8, or Article 8, transportation, facilities, and capital improvements. And then March 22nd is the date for either a snow day for other presentations that might get snowed out, or adult education, or both. We also want to go over the revenue that night. So just to pause and say a little bit about revenue. Our revenue sources are derived primarily from 2 areas. One is general purpose aid, which comes from the state of Maine, and the other is the Auburn taxpayer, which produces about half of our revenue in both categories. We watch other revenues very carefully, but those are our biggest revenues. We will get from the Department of Education an indication of what our revenue will be probably the last week in February. That's when they give us what is considered the beginning of the revenue process. We'll get our GPA printout. It won't be official until the legislature hits Sine Die, which is usually in June, and then it's enacted. So we watch that revenue line pretty carefully because it can and has changed before. So April 5th, we predict there will be a public hearing on the school budget. That's typically held before a regular school committee meeting. It has been your practice before. We have a joint meeting with the City Council and a budget workshop. That date has not been set yet. May 3rd, we would ask you to book approval of the school department's budget. The City Council will then have a discussion again regarding our budget, and the June validation referendum, or the budget validation referendum, BVR, you'll hear me refer to it that as well, has been set for June 13, and that's when the citizens in Auburn actually vote regarding whether they support or they don't support the school budget. We've had pretty favorable odds in the last 3 years. The citizens in Auburn have voted to support our budget either 3-1 or 4-1, so we've done well with them. So one of the things that we would like to talk about with you this evening is our fixed costs for 23-24. And these pertain primarily to salaries and benefits. So we have a settled contract with the Teachers Association, and again, hats off to Chairperson Matthew and Mr. Belknap for negotiating that agreement. That was settled this July, I believe, is when that was actually signed. And that's very helpful to us because now I know what those fixed costs are going into the 23-24 budget. It's much more difficult if we have a contract that is not signed, not settled, because then I have to guess. And it's just better. So for the increase here, and this is excluding health insurance, we anticipate an increase of $883,901, and it's a 4.23 increase. And that's general fund only. That's not the titles, that's not anything that's an ESSER, that's just the general fund operating budget. So the next settled agreement that we have is with the secretaries and ed techs. That again is, we are anticipating a 4.1% increase of $138,922. Next up is the administrators. And again, an increase of $69,726, or 3%. And then the last category of salaries and benefits is everything other than that, including transportation. And Mark, if I might ask you to speak to why that's higher this year than the other units.
Yeah, I think there are two reasons. First of all, the built-in increase is, I think, 4.5%. But one of the things we've found is we've historically underfunded the number of hours that our drivers are actually working. So we've increased the hours for our drivers in the budget by about 20%. I think of it as truth in budgeting, so we're actually budgeting the hours we anticipate our drivers working. So there's a cost increase there.
Thank you. And moving on. So one of the big factors this year, and this is a huge one, will be health insurance. We are estimating a 15% increase for health insurance. We get, about this time of year, it's our usage rate. What's the?
Loss ratio.
Our loss ratio from the Maine Education Association Benefits Trust. And then we try to bench that against last year. And so, and we look at the ratio between the two, and unfortunately, it went up about 11%. So we know that we've got to, usually we budget about 10% for health insurance. Even conservatively, Mark and I talked, it needs to go up to 15, and that's an increase of $905,000 and change. So we usually get our rates the beginning of April, and that's helpful because we have that number before we go in to meet with the city council. But it's a big number. And Mark and I have both done budgets for a very long time. It's always tempting to not put in enough to cover your health insurance costs, but they are a fixed obligation, and if they come in high and you haven't budgeted, the money has to come from somewhere. So it's prudent, in my opinion, to put that money into the budget at the front end. So the next item we want to share with you in terms of fixed costs, when you add those items together, you get an increase of $2,277,573, or 6.5%. This is an estimate. We will finalize this as the positions become more clear in the budget and the health rate insurance is actually established. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you have the next section.
Oh, this slide. I didn't format correctly on here. So I'm going to have to talk through some numbers with you. So one of the concerns we've talked about through the budgeting process for the construction of the high school is the increasing cost of debt as two different bond issues start to come into play for the high school. And a couple of points I would make on debt service. So unlike your home mortgage, where you pay the same amount every month, year over year, municipal debt is different. Once you have your principal and interest payments in effect, your debt starts to go down a little bit every year because you basically pay the same or very small changes only in principal, but your interest costs are based only on your remaining principal, so your interest costs go down over time. So the good news is once you build in your debt service into your base budget, it's going to go down a little bit every year. So you can see that here with Park Avenue. So we really only have two schools that have state-approved debt service, Park Avenue and Edward Little. And what we're showing here is only the local share. So 88% of the debt service, for example, for Edward Little, is being picked up through an increase each year in state aid to offset the increase in the debt service and then to match the debt service as it slowly declines. So this is really the piece that people are concerned about because this is what impacts your local tax rate. So if you look at Park Avenue, you can see it goes down a little bit from FY23 all the way through FY26, and it's paid off. So in FY27, you have no debt. Again, I don't know what happened to this slide. It was fine this afternoon. So I'll simply note, as you look at the first bond issue for Edward Little, it's been fully brought into the base budget. So we have principal and interest payments this year. That'll move into the base budget next year and it'll go down a little bit. For the second bond, we've budgeted the interest payments, but the first principal payment won't occur till next year. And so the good news is we're 3/4 of the way, basically, almost 3/4 of the way towards building in the Edward Little debt service into our budget for the local share. But the difficult part of that, and I'll move to the next slide, is these first two rows reflect the last two rows on the last slide. So if you look at fiscal year 23 to 24, you can see an increase of $293,405 in debt service. That's the principal payment coming due for the first time for the second bond issue for Edward Little. It's actually a little bit more than that, but you have some reductions in interest costs. And then just staying here for a minute, you can see how it goes down a little bit each year as your interest costs decline, and it goes down by $61,000 in fiscal year 27 as your Park Avenue drops out. Anything in a bracket here is good news. It means your costs are going down and your revenue's going up. So once we get through next year, we're in great shape on our debt service because it will start to decline from year to year. It will be built into the base budget. So Dr. Brown and I have a proposal for how we might mitigate that impact next year. Think about the $293,000 on top of the $2.2 million we just talked about. So looking back at our fundraising efforts for the high school, we've talked about the fact there are really two pieces to our fundraising effort. There's specific items that people are donating to, such as rehabilitating the bell and moving it. But then there are naming rights where we said donations for naming rights will be placed towards the tax impact for the new high school. And that was actually something you talked about with the voters prior to the referendum. So we have our friends in the class of 1951, our amazing friends who just donated $400,000 for the naming rights to the auditorium. And so the intent of that would be to offset some of the impact of the debt service on the new high school. So what we're proposing is that we begin to use that next year, but we use it in a cautious way. You want to be careful not to take, whether it's this or as we think about fund balance, if you use all of it in one year and it's not there the next year, you've got a funding cliff because all of a sudden that revenue's dropped out. So all you're doing is postponing some pretty big ripples in the system that either require tax increases or budget cuts. So we're proposing we use half of it next year. So you see the $200,000, that would limit your increase in your debt service to $93,000. And then you start to feather it out over the next 3 years. So the following year, you would use $125,000. Now that, in essence, is a revenue decline of $75,000 because you're decreasing it from $200,000 to $125,000. But your debt service is dropping by about $32,000. So the net impact of that is an increase of $43,000 on the tax rate. As you look towards the next year, you're going to drop it down and use the remaining $75,000, which is a decline of $50,000 in your tax rate, but you're also, again, seeing a decrease in your debt service. So that increase is only $17,000. And then the final year, when you're dropping out $75,000 in revenue, you actually have a $61,000 drop in debt service. So your increase that year is only $13,000. So that would be one proposal. I'm sure this will be a conversation in the budget process, but that would be one way of using those $400,000 in the donation from the class of 1951 for what we think was its intended purpose, which is to mitigate the impact of the tax increase on the local tax rate. So I'm sure there'll be more discussion on that. We have a number of other areas where there will be a sharp increase in costs. Utility costs are going to be very painful. We've had a 3-year contract for natural gas that ends at the end of this year in June of '23. We reported out at the last Finance Committee meeting last month that we have taken a new 1-year contract for electricity because that contract ran out. And then that's increasing by 239%. I would know we had, I think, a 3-year contract.
239%.
We had a 3-year contract on electricity, I believe. It made sense to go with a 1-year contract for a couple of reasons. Going to a multi-year contract didn't really save us much, but by going to a 1-year contract, we align ourselves with the city's contract for utilities so that we can then work together with the city in the future. And the city's actually looking at using our energy consultant, Comprehensive Energy Services, CES. So we have an energy consultant we work with for this. And we'll begin to align ourselves with the city, and then we can bid out for these rates together. And our energy consultant is actually bidding out our energy contracts for next year for natural gas and electricity so that we can begin to get a sense. It doesn't mean we're necessarily going to buy the contracts for next year, but it will give us a good sense of what we should be planning on for next year. But presumably you're not going to see a sharp reduction from where we are now, and where we are now is 239% more for electricity than where we started the year. So, and I put these numbers up here so you can see the magnitude of these accounts. So the current budget is basically almost $400,000 for electricity and $328,000 for natural gas. So percentage increase on these numbers is not small when we're talking these kinds of percentage increases. And now we have the excitement of opening a new Edward Little High School, tempered a little bit here by the increasing costs. So I note that you're going from a building that's 164,000 square feet to 278,000 square feet. That's a 70% increase in the size of the building. And certainly some of that is driven by the auditorium and the CTE programs, which we didn't have before, but it's designed to meet education in the 21st century and a larger number of students. There are some costs we can anticipate that will be ongoing operating cost increases. You'll need additional custodians to maintain a building that size. You're also going to see an increase in utility costs. Now, it's been built as a very efficient school, much more efficient than the one we have now, but that's offset by the additional square footage. I would also note, because we put in a geothermal system, geothermal systems tend to run heavy on the electricity as opposed to the natural gas, because you're continuously pumping water through those underground wells, which needs electricity for the pumps. So our natural gas may actually not go up much, if at all, but your electricity costs are going to go up significantly. There are also going to be some one-time costs. With the additional size of the building, we need 6 additional photocopiers with software to run those. We need additional allowances for moving chemicals and technology into the new school. The technology I'm referring to are the cameras that are installed in every classroom that we installed during the pandemic for remote instruction. Those have to be on-installed and reinstalled in each classroom. We don't have the staff for that, so it's likely we'll have to have a contracted service for that. And then we can anticipate a lot of miscellaneous items, and they may seem small, but with an additional number of classrooms we're going to have and the size of the school, you're going to have to buy more flags, you're going to have to buy more waste baskets. Custodial carts can be over $1,000, several $1,000s a cart, and you need one for every custodial closet. So we're starting to think about things down to that level of detail. So the one thing I didn't note here, and I should have, is the new high school is worth about $94 million more on the books than the current high school. And we have to insure that additional property value. So your property insurance is going to be significantly higher as well. In fact, I think the new high school will probably be worth as much as the rest of the district combined. So there's going to be some real costs to that too. And there are a few other cost increases. I think the city has found it difficult to manage support services at the current level within the contract, which is $62,500 first in transportation and then in facilities. And so we're looking at a cost increase there. The way I think about this is I was surprised coming into a district of this size that you had one person doing both. By and large, districts with this many students and this many schools have a transportation and a facilities director, and you only had one position. So this is really catching up to where we needed to be in our management costs. The other piece is gasoline. Now, I put this in here. Gasoline costs are going up sharply, and the city actually just bid out gasoline for us. I haven't seen the results yet. This may not be as bad as I thought, because I realized we're only using about 55 to 60% of our budget for that. Now, that probably reflects the fact we have a shortage of drivers, so there are days we can't put every bus on the road, but that's another utility cost that we can anticipate increasing. So those were some of the thoughts we had for additional costs. We haven't been able to quantify all of them, but we know they're going to be there on top of the $2.2 million that Dr. Brown enunciated. So with that,
Your questions, thoughts, and discussion.
All right, I'll open it up to the school committee. Any initial thoughts, or are we just sitting and absorbing all of this information for a moment? I'll give you a moment, but as you think about the notes that you took, or some, like I said, some questions that you might have that are percolating in your mind. Pat, have one? I don't forget to push the button.
Green light's on so they can hear me.
Yep.
So much of the increase that you're talking about, regardless of talking about the teachers and all of that, but all of this utility and et cetera, is really beyond our control. So, and there's not, from my perspective, there's not much we can do to lower those costs, at least off the top of my head.
well, that's why we use the word fixed at the beginning of the presentation, because they are uncontrollable. You're right. So we have to build in the costs realistically, Dr. Brown noted, and we have, these are contractual obligations, and I think people can understand that, and everybody can certainly understand increases in utilities. So it really becomes a matter of types of decisions you're then forced to make to recognize how high these costs are and try to offset them somehow.
So it doesn't really give us much wiggle room on the other side. Implement anything new.
Can I actually just expand on that for a minute? These are fixed, I'm thinking of the utility costs principally. These are fixed in the short run. In the long run, you can take steps to try to become more efficient, and we are doing just that. You approved entering into a contract with EEI and Harriman Associates, I think it was at your last meeting or 2 meetings ago, to begin a process of analyzing our heating and ventilation systems to look for potential savings by upgrading those systems. Now, the savings may largely be offset by the cost of the upgrades, but it will be at least budget neutral. But I think as we look at these types of increases, it's really important for the public to know that we're being proactive in trying to address them over the longer periods of time that you can. And so we'll be doing a lot of work over the next year and trying to identify areas where we can further reduce our utility costs through upgrades over the long term. But in the short term, it is.
Jason?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Mark said a little bit. I mean, it even goes past just this past year. If you look back at how the city and the school were thinking about this day, we front-loaded bonds 2 years ago when the rates were extremely cheap, saved a ton of money. We knew this day was going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, we bonded the high school, and we did because, I mean, listen, the economy is a dismal art, but there's certain predictabilities. It runs in cycles. It's hot, then it's cool, then it's hot again, right? So we bonded the high school when we did, which probably saved, if we had to bond that high school today, would have, Mark?
Over the life of the bond, the city's financial consultant estimated a savings of $800,000 had we waited until October to bond rather than April.
And that's a year.
No, well, 800,000 over the life of the bond.
But if we were bonding it today at today's bond rates,
Yeah.
you know, and construction costs and so forth, so we're talking millions. And, you know, I was part of the work group that chose the energy auditor. It's made of myself, Dr. Brown, Mark, and 2 city staffers that are obviously engineers and part of facilities. You're seeing all the work that we're doing with the MOU, the joint collaboration on energy audits. They're not going to have a short-term payoff, but compared to municipalities around the state, and I always hate comparisons, we are head and shoulders above everybody else. I do think it's important for people to know that we have some forward thought on this, and previous councils and previous school boards. I will say, though, the model in which we deliver services statewide has been unsustainable now for a generation. It will not get better next year or 30 years from now unless concrete steps are done now. And I always look at it as, what can we do? Yeah, nothing really is popping up into my mind either, Pat. Absolutely not. But that's our job, is to figure out those solutions, because there's always a solution to mitigate a problem. We just haven't thought of it yet, but we do have to. And I think that's where workshops and additional meetings might be in order to really dissect the budget. It's going to happen in the municipal side too, so.
I think as I'm sitting here, nothing is surprising me that you've just said. We negotiated the contract. We knew that that there would be, you know, an impact to the budget. We know, just stepping out of your household every day, you know the impact to your wallet every day when you go to the gas pumps, when you're paying your electrical bills. So the school would be no exception, and running the schools would be no exception to what is happening in the economic world today. So I think for me, understanding these costs and where these costs come from, I so appreciate that I can understand a budget when it is completely presented, that I understand if there needs to be an increase in this area or we can decrease in this area, because you have thought it through with you and your team have really always have come just hitting it out of the ballpark for us as far as making sure we understand what we are voting on. I also look to you and give kudos to you, because you do not think, you talk about Dr. Brown, you talk about 3 operating budgets, but I know you're already in the 24-25 school year. So, and you're smirking because it's true. So I know you think long haul, which as a city, well, I will say we're grateful for thinking that far ahead and for making sure that we are fiscally prepared to offer, you know, your words, a world-class education and continue a world-class education, as we're here to do exactly that. So we need the people, we need the facilities, and we need to just keep moving forward. But what I also know is that if there is an area where we can, and I'm not saying making cuts by any means, but if there's just an area that monies could be better allocated and impact students more in this area, then I know that you look very closely with you and your team behind you as well to make sure that we're spending every penny where it's supposed to be spent. So I thank you for all of that forward thinking. Those are my thoughts right now. I don't have a lot of questions, but just my thoughts right now. Anyone else? Clarissa? Sure. Yep.
I fully agree, but I still have some questions. There are informational questions. I was curious as to whether the school department has considered, I don't even know if these are legit, if these work, but any programs, there's a lot of programs to decrease the loss ratio on insurance, like different ways to sort of keep people healthier. I don't even know what the evidence is about those working. I know that a lot of employers offer them, so I don't know if we offer any of those types of like nutrition or exercise or employee assistance programs, but the kinds of things that reduce that loss ratio.
The benefits trust that we're part of, the MA Benefits Trust, actually does have wellness incentives for staff. I think there are times we could probably do a better job publicizing that to staff, but there are some cash incentives for reaching certain wellness goals, and we do offer that.
But does that decrease the rate, or does that just compensate folks for participating in those programs?
It compensates folks who
Okay.
participate in the program, like we'll give them a bonus of $100 if they meet their
Okay.
goals in the program.
But I don't know if it impacts the rates.
Well, it could impact the rate over time if people are healthier, because the rate does vary
true.
based on your losses compared to your premium. It's our understanding from the Benefits Trust that for us, our losses are in some instances driven by more chronic illnesses of employees. So it won't be it'll take time to try to get into a better place, but I think you're asking a good question, and I think we need to be looking at doing more for that.
Yeah.
Then my other question was about, in terms of these personnel estimates, I'm assuming that this is calculating for all positions that are required being filled ideally?
Dr. Brown, you have to push your button. Sorry.
Thank you. This is the maintenance budget. So if everybody in current employ with us went forward, this is what it would cost.
So it does include vacant positions, because they're still in the budget until the school committee eliminates those positions. They're still in the budget.
So it includes all unfilled positions. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Dr. Brown, Mark, Dan?
What about new positions in the school that we'll need?
So the positions that I referenced earlier, I do not have in that proposed $2.2 million. The extra custodians that Mark talked about are not included in that.
And all the other staff, like programs, and that's not included either, right?
The current staff that we have are included.
But I mean, any of the new ones in the high school besides the custodian?
Things that might be funded through the technical center programs.
Right.
That would be in addition to, although I believe that's funded through Lewiston, right, Mark?
Yeah, I think that would be funded through the Lewiston Technical Center. So we're not building that staff into our budget. And then they're gonna actually take 3 years before they open all of their programs, so it's gonna take some time. But that would be funded through Lewiston Regional Technical Center.
Okay, that's a great question, Dan. All right, sure. Yep, Pat?
Can you speak to the reimbursement from the state I know it's going to be in Lewiston's budget, but it's always been my understanding that the state pays for those courses. Is that correct?
For the technical center programs, so it's my understanding that the way that is run here, Lewiston collects all of the tuition from the state. They pay Lewiston directly. And so we can send our students there for free, and the money that we would have received for tuition goes to Lewiston.
Sure, Clarissa?
In the past, you talked about the moving costs for EL, and I can't remember if that's already been accounted for, or I didn't hear that be mentioned.
It's in, 165 was in the 22-23 school year. So just to get back to the technical question, when you go through your articles, you may notice that Article 3 is never discussed, and that is the CTE article, and therefore, we don't have any dollars in that line, so we don't present on it. Those dollars go directly to Lewiston in form of tuition reimbursement.
Okay, sure. Pam?
To kind of piggyback off of Clarissa's question, as far as the destruction of the old EL and the cost that that's going to claim, is that part of this budget or is that separate?
The demolition of the existing high school is part of the construction budget. Now, we have some concerns about whether there's enough money there for the PCB abatement, and that's why we submitted a revolving renovation fund grant for that. But any resolution ultimately in the final cost of taking that building down will have to come through the construction process, not through the operating budget.
So you have to think of them as two separate budgets. Right, any other questions or thoughts? All right, seeing none, I am going to say once again, thank you very much for taking us through this first dip into the 23-24 budget. All right, back to the agenda for a moment. We have some upcoming meetings coming up through November and December. I would ask that the school committee also make sure that they have the December 14th, 2022. Dr. Brown, that's an executive session, 6 p.m. December 14th. Executive session, December 14th.
I don't have my calendar. I don't remember what December 14 is.
I think it's 6 p.m. It will be only an executive session.
Oh, yes. Now I remember what December 14 is. That's correct.
6 p.m.?
Yes.
Okay. Will that be here in chambers or upstairs in the fourth floor?
It should be here in chambers if the room is available.
Okay. I do need a quorum. Yes. Yes. So December 14th, 6 p.m. here in chambers. It will be listed on the next agenda as executive session only. Okay. With that, I will-
Excuse me,
Oh, sorry.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mayor,
just
sorry.
one more addition.
Sure.
December 19th is our
Decem-
joint meeting. I know it's a little bit further out, but I want to make sure everybody has enough time to
I
get
think it's
the-
important to put all these dates right in
Yeah.
front of us. Absolutely.
But I want to make sure there's no excuse not to have an ugly sweater, like you all did last year.
He's a little salty. He's a little salty about that one. December 19th, I think Dr. Brown alluded to it just at the beginning, or that might have been in another meeting, I can't remember. December 19th, 5:30 workshop, city council. Initial budget. Okay, we'll get that date and time. Well, I know it is December 19th. We'll get the time, but that's our joint meeting with the city council for budget. All right, anything else? All right, seeing nothing, I'll take a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Thank you, Brian. Can I have a second? Somebody push a button. Second. Thank you, Clarissa. Somebody push a button and comment. All right, all those in favor of adjournment? We pass. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.